Prime Minister, just a handful of further questions, and as you'll appreciate from our processes, these are questions I've specifically been asked on behalf of call participants to ask you. The first is a matter of detail. When the compensation study from Sir Robert Francis was provided to government, which was in March 2022, you were still Chancellor at that stage. Do you know whether, as a matter of fact, your department did any work to cost it?
I'm not aware, to the best of my recollection.
But that's an issue which presumably somebody within your department would be able to assist us with answering. So somebody within the Treasury, no longer your department.
I would imagine, but as I said, it was not something that I'm directly even aware of.
Second question is this. You said in the course of your evidence these words, ultimately it's in the inquiry's control when it reports, and then you referred to the government proposing to respond to the inquiry's final report for the purposes of compensation. And these are the questions I'm asked to ask you in relation to that. First, I'm going to say both of them because you may want to answer them together. First, is the government using the inquiry's timeline for reporting as an excuse not to provide compensation for victims? And relatedly, does the government not wish to compensate victims based on the evidence it must already be aware of, which has been publicly given to this inquiry and which you have admitted was an appalling scandal?
I'm happy to provide reassurance. Of course, it's not an excuse, and obviously we had an extensive dialogue about how government typically would wait for an inquiry to conclude all their findings, present all those to government so that it has all the information it needs to make final decisions. And as we've discussed, that work is ongoing in advance of the final report coming, so it's in no way excuse, but it is a step that is required. And the second question is, again, I think related, there is no desire not to do this and take this forward. Obviously, a final decision on compensation has not been made, as I articulated earlier, but the moral case for compensation has been accepted, interim payments have been made, and work is ongoing across government on the basis of the interim report about how any future such compensation might be delivered.
The next questions pick up on that issue of waiting for the final report. You indicated that the government would always await the final report of an inquiry before acting. As I'm sure you'll appreciate, the Inquiries Act expressly empowers an inquiry to report on an interim basis. Otherwise, this and many other inquiries wouldn't have had the power so to do. What's the purpose of an interim report if the government will not act upon its content until a final report is delivered?
I can't remember the exact language used, but I think at the time it was acknowledged that it was an unusual step, the interim report's recommendations. I believe that was the word that was used, or it was a word similar to that. So I think the report itself acknowledged that the fact that it was an interim report making recommendations was unusual, and those interim recommendations were acted on within weeks. As a matter of general principle and historical precedent, good policy making and legal advice would suggest that it's important for government to have the full findings of an independent inquiry before making final decisions.
If it's government practice and precedent for the reasons you've referred to await the final report of an inquiry so that its recommendations could be considered in context, why did the government, as you've repeatedly referred to, choose to make substantial interim payments last summer without awaiting the final report? And surely the same considerations apply.
No, because I think the government at the time, which I was not a part of, so I wasn't part of that government decision-making process. I'd left government by that point. I think the government believed at that point that given those recommendations were specific and tightly defined, that it would be possible to do that, and it was the right thing to do, something that I agreed with at the time, but I wasn't in government, so I wasn't privy to the decision-making around that decision.
In relation to the recommendation that's in the second interim report, the most recent interim report, the recommendation of interim payments to parents and children, and leaving aside the other recommendations, which may be more complex in terms of the infrastructure of a of a compensation scheme, why why does the government need to see the inquiry's findings in context and work through the findings thoroughly in terms of considering the further recommendation for interim payments when the government was able to swiftly implement the first recommendation without working through the remainder of the inquiry's findings?
Again, I wasn't in government when that original decision was made, so I'm not able to speak to what happened. I wasn't a member of the government, didn't have access to those papers. I was a backbench MP at that time. And with regard to the second interim report, again, as the conversation we've had, matters of eligibility, scope, are all things that are under active consideration by government and as part of the policy-making process that is underway and the MCO spoke to in detail.
The final area for questions is, I just want to go back to Ms Morden's evidence and the question of legislation. Again, I'm just going to read what Ms Morden told us. We're about to go into the fourth and final session of legislation. I know that's going to be a short session. There are carryover bills. Whilst there are policy areas still to be resolved and not questions that I can answer on that, what I can tell you is that in terms of this government and this Prime Minister's priorities going into that fourth session, this is one of his priorities. And you, I think, indicated that Ms Morden was right to refer to the compensation payments as one of your priorities going into the fourth session. To clarify, and this is the question I'm asked to ask you, is it one of your priorities to introduce legislation on the compensation scheme in the fourth legislative session of this year?
I can't speak to the composition of the King's Speech in the fourth session legislation for obvious reasons. That's still something that government has to take a view on. I was talking more generally about this being a priority of mine for all the reasons that I've outlined previously in the session and the actions that the government has taken since I've become Prime Minister. I hope would demonstrate that it is something that I take seriously, that we have prioritised, and the seniority of the cabinet level attention it's had from the MCO, indeed my presence here today, and the work that has happened in government and the acceptance of the moral case are all demonstrations that this is a priority for me.
There may be a disconnect then between what you're saying to us and what Ms Morden has said to us. Ms Morden, obviously in her position as Leader of the House, is maybe in a position to deal with matters of proposed legislative sessions that you're not. It is important that people are not left confused about what the position is. So it is, I'm not asking you if you don't know the answer to give us an answer today. Is this a matter that you can, that further inquiries can be made just to confirm what the position is in that regard?
I can give you the position clearly now. Decisions on fourth session legislation have not been made. They are a matter as per usual government decision making through collective responsibility.
So are you saying to us that Ms Morden was wrong in what she said?
No, I think, again, I can't speak for her, but as you read her evidence to me, she said that this was a priority for me. Yes, it is a priority for me. That is completely consistent with me also saying that decisions on fourth session legislation have not been made. I think those two things are entirely consistent.
So I'm not going to pursue that further now, but it may be a matter that the inquiry might want to consider whether it for its own purposes, it needs any further clarity in relation to that. But I don't think I can sensibly take that matter further with the Prime Minister, given his answers. I'm just going to turn and see. There are no further matters that I'm asked to raise. Do you have any questions, Mr. Sunak?
I have no questions beyond those that I've already asked.
Mr. Sunak, is there anything that you wish to add?
I'll just, I think, conclude where I started, really, which is to acknowledge that this is and has been an appalling scandal. Many of you in this room, many watching, many others affected over a period of decades, not months or years. And those affected, as I said, is a broad group, not just those who were directly impacted, but their families, friends, carers as well. And I recognise that those layers of injustice have continued. This is not something that's only happened in the past. This is something that is still affecting families today. And as when you read some of the testimonials that I referred to earlier as well, it's hard not to be enormously moved by them, as I am, and for the people who have come forward to talk about their experiences deserve our praise and our gratitude for doing so. It's not easy to talk about, for example, the social stigma that was attached to all of these things in years gone by, which I can't imagine what that was like to live with. I think one of your testimonies talked about someone losing their job as a result, and thankfully I hope we have moved on from that, but that would have been appalling, as well as a tragic loss of life. And I'm pleased to be able to be here today to participate in this inquiry's important work, which I fully support, which is why the government has fully supported the inquiry, and my determination is to deliver the appropriate redress and recognition that people need and deserve as quickly as thoroughness allows. And hopefully, whilst the wait has been long, people can see that there has been forward movement since the time I was Prime Minister, and that should give them some encouragement and hope that we will get this done.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Sir Brian.
Well, I thanked you at the beginning for making space in your calendar to come here today. You will realize, I think, now how important that is. It's important in particular because when I wrote my second interim report, which I recognized was an unusual step, given that there was no further evidence we had thought to be heard before the final report was drafted. Because, as I said, in conscience, I could not countenance there being any further delay on my part before the recommendations which I was making would be put into effect. I said that I thought there was no reason, given political will, why they could not be put into effect this year. You will realize that to everyone here, I think, it's one of the unfortunate aspects of being Prime Minister, you embody political will. And they will take away, I think, from the evidence you have given, the reassurances that you have said in terms, of course we will put it right, of course it's the case we are committed to compensation to those infected and affected. You have agreed that it is one of your priorities, it is a priority, and that word is a word of considerable importance. Not everything can be a priority. And you have endorsed Penny Morden's wish to have it sorted on our shift, your government's shift. You will take away, I hope, the need for many to see tangible reassurance of that. You have pointed out that you have been one of the Prime Ministers who actually matched rhetoric with some action. On your shift, so far, we've had interim payments, albeit agreed before you came in, but you had committed yourself to them anyway in the course of the election campaign for that. You have pointed to the fact that you have been in charge of the government when it recognized the moral case for compensation as no previous government had done. And you have made it clear in what you have said today, right from the start, that you recognize the wrongs were done, and the way in which over so many years people's desires have been brushed aside by government. And that, you said, was wrong. You're speaking of previous governments, of all descriptions. They will be looking, I suspect, for yet further tangible recognition. They recognize the evidence they've heard this week of work being done. But there aren't any details. There is no timeline. There is no structure yet in place. If there is anything that you can, in the interim, do to reassure them, preferably by actions rather than by words, but either will do, actions preferably, that there will be the compensation which is just and fair, and it will be delivered as soon as possible. Because if it troubles my conscience, I would think it will trouble the conscience of a caring government. And you have said that's what you would wish to be. So, thank you for your evidence. You will see, you just had it demonstrated, the importance of what that means to people, and for the time that you have spent, as you have said, at short notice. It needs to be recognized, and that is some indication, some action that you've taken to honor those words. Thank you.
So just before we rise, and we're not sitting tomorrow, we are next sitting on Thursday afternoon to hear the evidence of the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
We will, however, consider...
Friday afternoon, I'm sorry.
We will, however, consider sitting where we are just for a little while longer to let the Prime Minister retire. Thank you very much.